It was a raw, unforgiving March morning in 1945, the kind that gnawed at a man's bones near the scarred borderland separating Allied gains from the tenacious German defense, not far from the ancient Roman city of Trier. A lone American Jeep, its olive-drab paint dulled by mud and miles, rumbled to a halt at a makeshift checkpoint. Ahead, a barricade of oil drums and razor wire cut across the pockmarked road, guarded by a young corporal from Ohio, barely old enough to shave, his M1 Garand held loosely but ready. The wind, sharp and metallic with the scent of distant cordite and damp earth, whipped at his helmet. He raised a gloved hand, a universal signal to halt, his breath misting in the frigid air. In the passenger seat of the Jeep sat a figure that seemed carved from granite. Older, with a face weathered by sun and war, he wore a simple, unadorned field jacket. No rank insignia, no identifying patches, a deliberate, almost defiant anonymity. But the M1 helmet, perched at a rakish angle, and the twin pearl-handled revolvers holstered on his hips, gleaming faintly even in the dull morning light, were an unmistakable signature. The corporal's eyes, initially scanning for identification, widened perceptibly, a jolt of recognition, and perhaps a shiver of dread running through him. General Patton, the living legend himself. The corporal swallowed hard, the taste of fear and awe dry in his mouth. "Open the gate, son!" Patton's voice, raspy yet resonant, cut through the biting wind. It wasn't a request, it was an unequivocal command. "Sir, General, sir, I can't," the corporal stammered, his gaze flicking nervously towards the desolate expanse beyond the wire. "Beyond this point is no man's land. We haven't secured the area yet. There are German stragglers, possibly snipers, sir. My orders." Patton's steel-blue eyes, sharp as a hawk's, fixed on the young man. "Then I'll be the first American through, Corporal," he stated calmly, a chilling edge beneath the placid tone. "Open the goddamn gate!" The corporal's face went pale. He glanced desperately over his shoulder at his sergeant, a grizzled veteran leaning against a sandbagged bunker, who merely offered a weary shrug and a resigned shake of the head. They'd all heard the stories. You didn't argue with Patton, not with that look in his eyes. The makeshift gate groaned open on rusty hinges. Sergeant John Mims, Patton's driver, a man whose face was a permanent mask of stoic apprehension, gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles shone white. The Jeep lurched forward, leaving the relative safety of the checkpoint behind. The road immediately deteriorated, becoming a cratered track winding through skeletal trees and the husks of what were once homes. "Sir," Mims ventured, his voice barely a whisper against the growl of the engine, "this really isn't safe. Intelligence reported." Patton didn't even turn his head, his gaze sweeping the ruined landscape. "That's what makes it interesting, Mims," he replied, a faint, almost predatory smile touching his lips. He was alive in this desolate theater, fully alive, where the thin veneer of civilization had been stripped away, leaving only instinct and will. The Jeep moved deeper into the scarred earth, 2 miles blurring past, through a village reduced to rubble and twisted metal, past abandoned German positions, foxholes half filled with water, discarded helmets, spent shell casings, into a forest where the canopy was still intact, but the silence was deafening, unsettling. American forces hadn't set foot here yet, according to the maps. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and an unspoken menace. Every rustle of leaves, every snapped twig beneath their tires was amplified, a drumbeat of approaching danger. Mims's heart hammered against his ribs. Then, as they rounded a tight, overgrown bend in the narrow forest track, the world seemed to lurch. A dark shape loomed out of the gloom. A German supply truck, its faded gray paint camouflaged imperfectly by the trees, was lumbering in the opposite direction. Both vehicles slammed on their brakes, tires skidding on the mud and gravel. For 3 interminable seconds, time ceased to exist. An American general in a Jeep. 6 German soldiers, dusty and war-weary, clambering out of their truck, their rifles already in hand, their faces etched with shock. Both sides stared at each other in absolute, bewildering disbelief. The silence was so profound it buzzed in Mim's ears. This wasn't supposed to happen. Then slowly, one of the German soldiers, a young man with a fear-stricken face, raised his hands, his rifle clattering to the ground. Then another, and another. Soon all 6 stood with their hands aloft. "Smart choice," Patton muttered, his gaze unwavering, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes. This was the story of George S. Patton's most insane habit: driving into unsecured territory, sometimes alone, sometimes stumbling onto enemy soldiers who had no idea what to do when they encountered an American general where no American general should possibly be. July 1944. The relentless, grinding push through Normandy. Most generals, commanders of vast armies, relied heavily on intelligence reports, their war rooms adorned with meticulously updated maps, crisp aerial photographs, and the crackle of intercepted radio communications. They commanded from a safe distance, making strategic decisions based on data. But George S. Patton Jr. was not most generals. "I need to see the terrain myself," he had declared to his exasperated staff, his voice echoing with an almost messianic conviction. "Maps lie. Intelligence is always wrong. The only way to truly understand the battlefield is to be on it, to feel the dirt beneath your boots, to smell the fear and the cordite in the air." His chief of staff, a man prematurely aged by Patton's audacious brilliance and terrifying unpredictability, would protest. "Sir, that's what reconnaissance units are for. We have highly trained men whose sole purpose is to gather this information." Patton would merely scoff, a dismissive wave of his hand. "Reconnaissance units tell me what they see. I need to see what they miss." And so, he developed a habit that terrified his entire staff, gave them ulcers, and utterly baffled German intelligence. He would drive, often in an unmarked jeep, to the very front lines, and sometimes, far beyond them, deep into enemy territory, to personally scout the terrain. There were no elaborate escorts, no heavy security detail, no convoy of armored vehicles, just him, a driver like the long-suffering Mims, and occasionally a lone aide, clutching a map with white knuckles. "If I bring a convoy," Patton would explain, his logic chillingly simple, "the Germans know I'm important, and they shoot at me. If I bring one jeep, I look like a lost supply officer. They'll just wave me through, or at worst, ignore me." The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. It was a gamble with his life and with the fate of his army that no sane commander would ever countenance. The first time he did this in France, the intelligence officer responsible for his safety nearly suffered a nervous breakdown. He found Patton, hours later, back at headquarters, sketching furiously on a map. "Sir, General, do you realize you drove 3 miles past our forward positions, into German-held territory? We thought you were captured, or worse." The officer's voice was a desperate, high-pitched squeak. Patton merely looked up, a triumphant glint in his eyes. "I know," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Found a perfect route for our tanks. The Germans haven't mined it yet. We attack tomorrow at dawn, before they figure it out." The sheer, unadulterated madness of it. And yet the attack succeeded brilliantly. The Germans, caught completely off guard, were routed by American tanks storming from a direction they had deemed utterly impassable, a natural choke point that Patton's eye for terrain had identified as their weak link. Patton was vindicated. His staff was, once again, traumatized, but his legend grew. The pattern was established. The old man was either a tactical genius or a lunatic with an uncanny streak of luck. Perhaps both. August 1944. The relentless summer heat baked the French countryside, and the Third Army was moving like a whirlwind, spearheaded by Patton's audacious tactics. He was en route with Sergeant Mims to visit a forward headquarters, the jeep kicking up plumes of dry dust from the sun-baked roads. In the chaos of rapidly advancing lines and hastily marked routes, they took a wrong turn. A genuine, uncalculated mistake, not one of Patton's deliberate probes. They realized their error with a chilling jolt when they passed a road sign, partially obscured by overhanging branches, written unequivocally in Gothic German script. "Sir," Mims said carefully, his voice taut with suppressed alarm, his eyes darting frantically left and right, "that sign, that wasn't in French, sir." Patton, ever the picture of unnerving calm, surveyed their surroundings. They were in a small village, eerily intact. No battle damage, no shell craters, no discarded American rations or equipment. A quaint church steeple, cobbled streets, houses with flower boxes, a picture of pastoral tranquility utterly out of place in the war zone, and most disturbingly, no American troops. "I think we're behind enemy lines, sir," Mims added, his hand unconsciously hovering near his sidearm. "Looks that way," Patton agreed, his tone almost conversational, as if discussing the weather. Just then, a German soldier, young and seemingly fresh from training, strolled casually out of a bakery, a loaf of bread tucked under his arm. He saw the jeep, the two Americans, and froze, mid-stride, bread nearly slipping from his grasp. His eyes, wide with confusion, locked onto Patton. For a beat, neither side moved. Then, Patton, with an almost imperceptible flick of his wrist, offered a casual wave. The German soldier, his mind clearly struggling to process the impossible sight, hesitated for another moment, then, bewildered, waved back. "Drive, Mims," Patton said, his voice dropping to an almost inaudible murmur. "Slowly, like we're supposed to be here." Mims, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, eased the jeep forward. They drove through the entire village at a leisurely pace, a surreal, almost dreamlike procession. They passed German soldiers relaxing, smoking cigarettes, cleaning their rifles, their expressions ranging from casual indifference to mild curiosity. They saw military vehicles parked haphazardly, their crews oblivious. A German officer, engrossed in conversation, glanced at them without recognition, his mind evidently far from the possibility of an American general cruising through his village. The entire episode felt like a bizarre tableau, a play where only Patton understood the script. Only when they were several miles clear, back in recognizable American-held territory, did Mims finally let out a breath he realized he'd been holding for what felt like an eternity. His shirt was plastered to his back with cold sweat. "Sir," he gasped, That was something." Patton merely grinned, a wolfish, satisfied curl of his lips. "That was good intelligence, Mims. That village has about 200 Germans in it. Light weapons, no tanks. We'll take it tonight." And they did. Third Army captured the village with minimal resistance, the enemy still reeling from the psychological warfare of a single jeep driving through their ranks. When the bewildered German commander was later interrogated, he mentioned something strange, almost unbelievable. "An American jeep drove through our position yesterday," he recounted, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "We thought it was a reconnaissance probe. By the time we realized they'd actually stopped to observe us, they were gone. It was like they were taunting us." The interrogator, well-versed in Patton's legend, didn't tell him it was the commanding general of the Third Army. September 1944. The Moselle River, a formidable natural barrier, now loomed before the advancing American forces. German engineers in their retreat had systematically destroyed most of the bridges, turning the waterway into a treacherous obstacle. American engineers were diligently searching for suitable crossing points, poring over maps, taking soundings, assessing the riverbanks. Patton, however, had little patience for their meticulous reports. His internal clock, his battlefield intuition, screamed for speed. He drove to the river himself, the trusty jeep bumping along a barely visible track. Parking abruptly, he disembarked and began to walk along the muddy bank, his figure starkly outlined against the gray sky. He was completely exposed, well within easy rifle range from the German side, where the enemy could be clearly seen, silhouetted against the opposite tree line. "Sir," his young aide, Lieutenant Collins, hissed, his voice trembling with barely controlled panic. "The Germans can see you, from across the river. They'll open fire." Patton didn't even flinch. He raised his binoculars, scanning the far bank with an intense, almost scientific detachment. "I can see them too, Lieutenant," he replied, his voice calm, steady, betraying no hint of fear. On the far side, German soldiers, initially confused, began to spot the lone American officer. A ripple of nervous energy passed through their ranks. A few raised their rifles, their intentions clear. Patton stood absolutely still, binoculars pressed to his eyes, utterly unconcerned, a statue of defiance against the backdrop of war. No shots came. The Germans were too confused, too bewildered by the sheer audacity of the man. Why was an American officer standing out in the open, calmly observing them, as if on a peaceful stroll? It defied all military logic, all common sense. His absolute lack of fear was a weapon in itself, disarming his enemies more effectively than any tank. After 5 agonizing minutes, which felt like an eternity to the shivering aide, Patton slowly lowered his binoculars. A faint smile, one of satisfaction, spread across his face. "Found our crossing point," he announced, his voice carrying clearly on the wind. 300 yards downstream. Water's shallow enough for Shermans." Collins, still white-faced, stared in disbelief. "Sir? How can you tell? I see nothing but currents and rocks." Patton gestured with an imperious sweep of his hand. "Look at the current, Lieutenant. Look at the rocks." And most importantly, look at where the Germans aren't defending. They're not stupid. They're not defending there because they don't think we can cross there. Can we? He turned, his gaze piercing. We'll find out tomorrow. They did. The next day, American forces crossed the Moselle at the exact spot Patton had chosen, surprising the enemy and further solidifying his almost mystical reputation for battlefield intuition. His eye for terrain, his audacious disregard for personal safety, had once again proven correct. October 1944. The autumn chill had settled over France, bringing with it mist and dampness near the ancient fortified city of Metz. Patton's jeep was approaching what, according to their maps, should have been an American checkpoint, the usual jumble of sandbags, a familiar weary GI waving them through. But as they drew closer, a cold knot of dread tightened in Mims's stomach. Too late, he realized the soldiers manning the checkpoint were wearing distinctly German uniforms, their Stahlhelms unmistakable in the fading light. "Sir," Mims started, his voice a choked whisper, his hand already moving towards the brakes. "I see them," Patton said, his tone utterly devoid of panic, a chilling calmness in his voice. "Keep driving. Don't stop." "Sir, they're going to stop us," Mims protested, his foot still hovering over the pedal. "No, they're not," Patton snapped, a sudden, fierce energy in his command. "Floor it, Mims! Floor it!" With a sudden surge of adrenaline, Mims slammed his foot down. The jeep roared, its engine howling like a banshee, surging past the surprised German soldiers. They shouted, their voices lost in the engine's clamor, their expressions a mix of disbelief and momentary confusion. They raised their weapons, but didn't fire. They were too stunned by an American vehicle and an obviously American officer that had just blown past them at full throttle, violating every rule of engagement. By the time their brains registered the impossible sight and they began to react, fumbling with their rifles, the jeep was already 200 yards away, a blur disappearing into the mist-shrouded road, still accelerating. "Are they following?" Patton asked calmly, as if inquiring about the weather, without so much as a glance backward. Mims checked the rearview mirror, his breathing ragged. "No, sir. I think they're too confused." A thin, satisfied smile played on Patton's lips. "Good. Mark that position on the map, Mims. That checkpoint shouldn't be there. The Germans have moved forward during the night. We need to adjust our lines. They've slipped through." Back at headquarters, Patton casually reported the new German position. Artillery barrages were swiftly ordered, and by nightfall, the rogue German checkpoint had been eliminated, its occupants either captured or dispersed. "How did you discover this, sir?" an intelligence officer asked, puzzled by the swift, accurate information. Patton merely shrugged, as if it were routine. "Drove through it," he said, taking a sip from his coffee, his eyes twinkling with mischievous pride. The officer's jaw dropped. "You... what, sir?" Patton chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "It's fine. They were too surprised to shoot." The legend grew, fueled by incredulous whispers and the grim determination of a general who seemed to thrive on flirting with death. November 1944. The Hurtgen Forest, a dark, brooding, and unforgiving labyrinth of tangled pines and deep ravines, was already becoming a meat grinder, a place where units vanished and men went mad. Patton was predictably scouting terrain for a planned offensive, attempting to find a weakness in its dense, claustrophobic defenses. Intelligence reports, ever optimistic, suggested the forest was lightly held by German forces. As his jeep crept cautiously along a narrow, mud-slicked forest road, the silence was suddenly shattered. Around a sharp bend, through a curtain of dripping branches, they encountered a German patrol. A full squad, perhaps 12 men, their field-gray uniforms blending almost perfectly with the somber hues of the forest. Both groups spotted each other simultaneously. For a single frozen moment, the world held its breath. No one moved. The air crackled with a primal tension, the scent of damp earth mingling with the metallic tang of fear. Then, with an almost theatrical flourish, Patton stood up in the jeep, his imposing figure framed against the oppressive backdrop of the forest. He drew one of his pearl-handled revolvers, the polished grip gleaming in the dappled light, and pointed it with unwavering certainty at the Germans. "Hände hoch!" he bellowed, his German rudimentary, guttural, but undeniably commanding. "Hands up!" The German soldiers, battle-hardened veterans by the look of them, exchanged confused glances. They outnumbered the Americans 12-2. They could easily overpower this jeep, capture its occupants, or simply mow them down. The thought flickered across their faces, a momentary defiance. But something in Patton's absolute confidence, his complete, almost insane lack of fear, his unblinking stare, made them hesitate. He wasn't just an officer, he was a force of nature, a palpable aura of unshakable will. One German soldier, a corporal with a scar across his cheek, slowly, tentatively raised his hands. Then another, then the entire squad, their rifles clattering to the forest floor. "Mims," Patton said calmly, never lowering his revolver, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Radio for infantry. We have prisoners." Mims, still reeling, stammered, "Sir, the radio doesn't have enough range in this forest. It's too dense." Patton's eyes narrowed. "Then drive back and get them. I'll wait here." Mims's jaw dropped. "Sir, you can't stay here alone, with 12 armed German soldiers." Patton merely arched an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his gaze. "Sure, I can. They're surrendering. Go." Against every instinct, every fiber of his being screaming in protest, Mims turned the jeep around and drove away, leaving General George S. Patton, armed with a single revolver, alone with 12 potentially hostile German soldiers in the heart of the Hurtgen forest. For what felt like an eternity, perhaps 20 minutes, Patton stood in the jeep, revolver drawn, staring down the prisoners. None of them moved. They were too confused, too uncertain, too utterly intimidated by the sheer, unblinking madness of the American general. When the American infantry patrol finally arrived, guided by the breathless Mims, they found Patton still standing, still pointing his weapon, and all 12 Germans sitting meekly on the ground, hands raised, waiting. "General Patton!" the infantry lieutenant gasped, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. "Sir, what are you doing here? Taking prisoners?" Patton, finally holstering his revolver, merely gestured dismissively at the Germans. "Get them processed, Lieutenant. They're yours." Later, at the POW cage, the German squad leader, through a bewildered translator, asked, Who was that officer, the one with the pistols?" When told it was General Patton, commander of the Third Army, the German's face went pale. "I surrendered to Patton?" he mumbled, disbelief and horror warring in his eyes. "He was alone." "Yes," the translator noted dryly. We could have killed him," the German whispered, shaking his head. "But you didn't," the translator observed. The German leader closed his eyes, a shiver running through him. He had the eyes of a madman, a crazy man. We were afraid of what he would do if we moved. December 1944. Near the ancient Roman-founded city of Koblenz, Patton's infamous habit of forward reconnaissance nearly claimed his life. He was driving through recently captured territory, areas supposedly cleared, when without warning, German artillery erupted. Not a random shelling, but a targeted, delayed ambush, their spotters having likely identified the lone jeep as a potential high-value target, or perhaps mistaking it for the vanguard of a supply convoy. Shells screamed down from the sky, detonating with earth-shaking force, showering the jeep with shrapnel and dirt. Mims, a seasoned driver but still human, swerved desperately, his face a mask of terror, trying to evade the blossoming inferno. One shell, a monstrous screech followed by a blinding flash, landed barely 5 feet from the jeep. The concussion was immense, a physical blow that lifted the vehicle clean off the ground. The world spun. Patton was violently thrown clear, landing hard on the frozen ground, the breath knocked from his lungs. He rolled to his feet, muscles screaming in protest, his ears ringing. "Mims!" he roared, his voice hoarse, his eyes darting frantically through the smoke and debris. The jeep lay on its side, a crumpled, smoking hulk. Mims was trapped beneath it, motionless, unconscious. Another shell shrieked, a metallic banshee in the air, before exploding 20 yards away, tearing a fresh crater in the earth. Patton, ignoring the searing pain in his arm and side, dove flat, the ground trembling beneath him. He then crawled towards the overturned jeep, his mind singularly focused. He gritted his teeth, straining, trying to lift the heavy vehicle by himself. It was impossible. Mims was pinned, a dead weight. Just as despair began to gnaw at the edges of his legendary resolve, the clatter of tank tracks shattered the cacophony. An American Sherman tank, part of a patrol that had heard the artillery, rumbled into view, its gun traversing wildly. "General Patton!" the tank commander bellowed from the turret. his voice incredulous, disbelieving, as he spotted the lone, dust-covered figure wrestling with the Jeep. "Get over here and help me lift this goddamn Jeep," Patton shouted back, his voice raw but still commanding. "My driver's trapped." The tank crew, shocked but instantly obeying, scrambled from their vehicle. Together, with a grunt of collective effort, they managed to lift the Jeep just enough to pull the unconscious Mims free. He was injured, bleeding, but alive. "Sir, what are you doing out here?" the tank commander asked, his face a mixture of awe and bewilderment. Patton, dusting himself off with a grimace, surveyed the smoking craters. "Reconnaissance," he stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, "and apparently running into an ambush. Radio headquarters. Tell them German artillery is active in this sector." The tank commander then noticed the blood dripping from Patton's left arm. "Sir, you're bleeding." Patton glanced down, as if surprised. His arm was cut, a jagged wound likely from the shrapnel or the impact. "It's nothing," he snapped, a flash of irritation in his eyes. "Get Mims to a medic. He needs immediate attention." "Sir, you should go too," the tank commander insisted. "I said it's nothing." Patton's voice crackled with impatient authority. "I have 3 more positions to scout today." He then coolly commandeered a vehicle from the tank unit, his unwavering focus on his mission, and continued his dangerous reconnaissance. That evening, back at headquarters, his chief of staff, upon seeing the bandaged arm and hearing the full report, exploded in a furious, desperate tirade. "Sir, you were nearly killed. Sergeant Mims is in the hospital. When are you going to stop taking these insane, suicidal risks?" Patton, his face tired but his eyes still burning with an unyielding fire, simply replied, "When the war is over, Colonel, or I'm dead, whichever comes first." December 1944. The brutal winter was setting in, and the intelligence reports flowing into German high command were increasingly alarming. After the war, historians poring over captured German documents uncovered a particularly revealing report from late 1944, a testament to Patton's unique brand of battlefield eccentricity. It stood out, almost humorous in its desperation, yet chilling in its implications for the Allied forces. The report titled Assessment of U.S. General G. Patton's Forward Activities read with a clinical detachment that couldn't quite mask the underlying bewilderment of its authors. Subject American General Patton repeatedly appears in forward areas with minimal security. Multiple sightings confirmed by different units across various sectors. October 15th, spotted observing bridge near Metz. Alone, standing in open, apparently unconcerned about sniper fire from our positions. October 23rd, drove through the village we controlled. Location redacted. Single Jeep. We did not recognize him until too late. Vehicle subsequently escaped. November 8th, encountered by patrol in Hürtgen Forest. Captured entire patrol single-handedly. Details unclear. Patrol refuses to explain how one man captured 12 armed soldiers. Discrepancy noted. Further investigation required. The German intelligence analysts, attempting to categorize this unprecedented behavior, concluded, Assessment. Subject exhibits reckless disregard for personal safety. Appears to have no fear of death. Behavior is either evidence of extreme courage or mental instability, possibly both. A chilling recommendation followed. If Patton is spotted, attempt capture rather than kill. An American general as prisoner would be of immense propaganda and strategic value. However, approach with extreme caution. Subject is armed and highly unpredictable. Secondary note. All attempts to predict Patton's movements have failed. He appears at random locations without discernible pattern or logic. Traditional intelligence methods for tracking high-value targets are ineffective. The report ended with a handwritten note, scrawled in what appeared to be the frustrated hand of a senior officer, echoing the sentiment of an entire military high command. Thank God the Americans only have one of him. This simple, heartfelt plea from the enemy underscored the profound impact of Patton's terrifying unpredictability. January 1945. The war was entering its final, bloody phase, and the stakes were higher than ever. At Supreme Headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, summoned Patton to a private, terse meeting. The air in Eisenhower's office was thick with unspoken tension, the scent of pipe tobacco heavy. "George," Eisenhower began, his voice weary but firm. "Sit down." Patton, his jaw set, complied, knowing precisely what was coming. The reports, the complaints, the near disasters. They had reached the highest echelons. "I've received reports," Eisenhower continued, his gaze unwavering, "that you're still driving to the front lines without proper security. That you've been spotted behind enemy lines multiple times. That you nearly got yourself killed last month when your Jeep was hit by artillery near Koblenz." Patton scoffed, a dismissive sound. "Intelligence reports, Ike, are often exaggerated. You know that as well as I do." Eisenhower leaned forward, his voice hardening. "These reports came from your own staff, George. Your chief of staff is terrified you're going to get yourself killed. He's a good man, and he's at his wit's end." Patton merely shrugged. "My chief of staff worries too much, Ike. He's a worrier." Eisenhower pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture of profound exhaustion. "George, you're the commander of Third Army. You're not a scout. You're not a forward observer. If you get killed, we lose one of our best, most aggressive generals. The momentum you've built, the morale of your troops, it would be a catastrophic blow." Patton's eyes flashed with his customary defiance. "If I don't scout the terrain myself, Ike, I make bad decisions. Maps lie. Intelligence is wrong. The only way I can command effectively is to see the battlefield with my own eyes, to feel it." Eisenhower sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of exasperation. "Then take security with you, for God's sake, a proper escort." "Security slows me down, makes me a target," Patton retorted, leaning forward, his voice gaining intensity. "I move faster and safer alone. A lone jeep is overlooked. A convoy draws fire." Eisenhower ran a hand through his hair. "You drove through a German-held village in August. You captured German soldiers single-handedly in November. You nearly died in December. This isn't reconnaissance, George. This is suicide with extra steps." Patton grinned, a thin, almost taunting smile. "I'm still alive, Ike, aren't I?" "By luck, not judgment, George. Sheer blind luck," Eisenhower thundered, pounding his fist lightly on the desk. "Call it what you want, Ike," Patton concluded, his voice softer now, but no less resolute. "Third Army moves faster and fights better because I know the terrain, because I see what needs to be seen. I won't command from behind a desk. I won't." Eisenhower sank back in his chair, a defeated sigh escaping his lips. He knew he wasn't going to win this argument. "At least," he said, his voice pleading, "promise me you'll take more precautions. Be careful, George." Patton's grin widened, a flash of pure, unrepentant mischief. "I'll take all necessary precautions, Ike." It wasn't a real promise, and they both knew it, but it was the best Eisenhower was going to get. April 1945. Germany was crumbling, its once formidable war machine now reduced to a desperate, fragmented resistance. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over, but Patton, driven by an inexhaustible energy and an insatiable need to push forward, made one last audacious reconnaissance trip. Deep into German territory he drove, into a position his maps still designated as contested, but what he found was not a fortified enemy stronghold, but a German military hospital. It stood like a ghost in the ruins of a small town, its Red Cross banners fluttering weakly in the spring breeze. Wounded soldiers, their faces pale and drawn, lay on cots or hobbled weakly through the corridors. Nurses, their uniforms stained with fatigue and blood, moved with grim purpose. Doctors, their shoulders slumped with exhaustion, administered what care they could with dwindling supplies. There were no combat troops, no defense, just medical personnel and patients, the innocent and the broken. Patton, his face a study in complex emotions, got out of the jeep and walked inside. A German doctor, his face streaked with grime and weariness, saw him. He recognized the American uniform, the imposing figure, and froze, his medical kit falling with a soft thud. "How many patients?" Patton asked in rough, heavily accented German, his voice betraying no aggression, only a pragmatic inquiry. 200, sir," the doctor stammered, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Wounded. We have no weapons. This is a hospital, civilian and military." "I can see that," Patton interrupted, his gaze sweeping the chaotic, yet organized scene. The facility was clean, but utterly overwhelmed with casualties. He saw the suffering, the dedication of the medical staff, the fragile humanity clinging to life amidst the devastation. "You will not be harmed," Patton told the doctor, his voice firm, authoritative, but now imbued with a surprising note of compassion. "Medical personnel are protected under the Geneva Convention. I'll send American medics to assist you. With supplies. The doctor stared, unable to comprehend. You are not arresting us? Patton shook his head. You're doctors, not soldiers. You have wounded to care for. Do your job. And with that, Patton turned and walked out, got back in his jeep. Sir, Mims asked, his voice tinged with surprise, should we call for troops to secure the hospital? Send medics, Mims, Patton said, his voice softened, his eyes now holding a hint of something reflective. And tell them to bring supplies. Those people need help. That evening, American medical units, laden with desperately needed supplies, reached the German hospital. They found German doctors and nurses still working, still caring for their patients. Because an American general, a man known for his ruthlessness, had told them they were safe, that they would be helped. Was he really Patton? A German nurse asked through a translator, her voice filled with a profound disbelief. Yes, the American medic replied. He walked in alone, no guards. That's Patton. The nurse shook her head, a strange mixture of awe and fear in her eyes. He is either very brave or very crazy. Both, the American medic replied, a wry smile touching his lips. Definitely both. December 9th, 1945. 8 months after the roar of guns had fallen silent, after the world had begun to breathe again, General George S. Patton, Jr. was still in Germany, serving as military governor of Bavaria. The fighting was over, the urgency replaced by the slow, painstaking work of reconstruction, but Patton, ever restless, still drove himself around, still refused heavy security details, still insisted on seeing things personally. He clung to his old habits, a man unable to shed the skin of a war he had so profoundly shaped. His staff, though relieved the combat was over, still worried about his disregard for personal safety. On this fateful day, his Cadillac staff car, driven by Private First Class Horace Woodring, was traveling on a quiet, tree-lined road near Mannheim. The air was crisp, the landscape slowly healing. Suddenly, a 2.5-ton army truck, its driver momentarily distracted, swerved sharply, making an unexpected left turn directly in front of Patton's car. The vehicles collided. It wasn't a catastrophic crash, by war standards. The truck driver was fine. Woodring, Patton's driver, was shaken but uninjured. But Patton, sitting in the back seat, his mind perhaps already miles away, planning the next phase of his post-war duties, was thrown violently forward. His head struck a metal partition with a sickening thud. His neck snapped back with brutal force. A sharp, searing pain exploded through his spine, followed by an immediate, terrifying numbness. I'm in trouble, he told the medics calmly, his voice steady despite the horror of the situation. I can't move my legs. He was rushed to a hospital in Heidelberg, a city he had once helped liberate. The injury was severe, a fractured cervical vertebrae, extensive spinal cord damage. For 12 agonizing days, he lay paralyzed from the neck down, struggling to breathe, his once indomitable will trapped within a failing body. This is a hell of a way to die, he told visitors, his voice a strained whisper, his eyes reflecting a profound, bitter irony. Not in battle, not leading men, in a goddamn car accident. On December 21st, 1945, George S. Patton, Jr., the man who had survived 4 years of driving into combat zones, who had stared down enemy soldiers alone and prevailed, who had seemed impossible to kill, finally succumbed. He was 60 years old. The news of his death rippled through Germany, reaching even the most unlikely ears. When German officers, now prisoners of war, heard about Patton's demise, their reactions were complicated, a mix of grudging respect and almost bewildered relief. He was a bastard, one former Wehrmacht general conceded, his voice raspy, but he was a magnificent bastard. The best tank commander either side had, bar none. Another, a seasoned panzer officer, shook his head slowly. I heard he used to drive to the front lines alone. I never believed it, until we captured some of his own soldiers, and they confirmed it. The man was insane. A third, an infantry colonel who had faced Patton's Third Army countless times, spoke with a mixture of weariness and awe. When we heard Patton was commanding against us, we knew we were in trouble. He attacked like a whirlwind. He moved like lightning. He never gave us time to rest or regroup. I hated him, but I respected him. He fought like a devil. And from a captured German intelligence officer, the architect of that desperate Patton assessment report, we tried to kill him so many times. Artillery, snipers, ambushes. He should have died a dozen times. The fact that he survived the entire war, endured everything we threw at him, and then died in a car accident. That, my friend, is the universe's sense of humor. A final, cruel joke. George S. Patton Jr. spent 4 years of war doing things no general should do. Driving to the front lines without security, walking through contested territory alone, encountering enemy soldiers and either capturing them or bluffing his way past them, scouting terrain personally under fire, completely exposed. His staff begged him to stop. Eisenhower ordered him to stop. Common sense demanded he stop. He never stopped. "Why do you do it?" an aide once dared to ask him, a young man genuinely perplexed by such reckless courage. "Why risk your life when you have intelligence officers and scouts to do this for you?" Patton paused, his gaze distant, contemplative. "Because I'm asking young men to die for me," he replied, his voice softening. "The least I can do is share their danger. If I'm not willing to risk my life, why should they risk theirs?" It was a noble sentiment, perhaps the truest insight into the heart of the enigmatic general. It was also undeniably insane. But it was precisely what made Patton the most feared Allied commander of the war. Not just because of his aggressive tactics or his relentless pursuit, but because his soldiers knew their general wouldn't ask them to go anywhere he wouldn't go first. When German soldiers encountered Patton where he absolutely shouldn't be, standing on a bridge under fire, driving through their positions, walking alone in no man's land, they faced an impossible choice. They could shoot an American general, one of the most valuable targets in the war, and risk the furious retribution of an army under his command. Or they could surrender to a man so confident, so fearless, so utterly convinced of his own destiny that being outnumbered didn't seem to matter to him. Most chose surrender, not just to a man, but to an unshakable belief. Because Patton had something that transcended tactics or firepower, an absolute, unshakable confidence that he was invincible. He wasn't invincible. He died, ironically, in a tragic, quiet car accident on a rural road. But for 4 long years, he had spent every waking moment convincing both his own soldiers and the enemy that he was, and that belief, that terrifying, glorious certainty, won battles. "Sir, you can't go there," his staff said 1,000 times. And 1,000 times, Patton went anyway, until the day he couldn't anymore.
Thank you for listening. Please share your thoughts, like this video if you found it helpful, and subscribe for more.